Hello, everyone.
You really shouldn't wear skirts like that, Chloe, James said, his eyes lingering just below my waist. Otherwise, I won't be able to focus on anything but you. I froze. His words hit me like a slap across the face. I blinked, trying to figure out if he was joking, but there was no hint of humor in his expression. My heart pounded in my chest, and a rush of heat crept up my neck. Was he serious? Here's the thing, I wasn't exactly innocent in all of this. I had picked out that tight black skirt on purpose. I knew it hugged my curves perfectly, and yes, I wanted him to notice me. I wanted to feel powerful, wanted to see if I could draw his attention in a way that had nothing to do with being his stepdaughter. But now that I had succeeded, I felt trapped, unsure of what to do next. I tried to play it cool, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. Didn't think it was a problem. James leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smirk. It's not a problem for me. But it might be distracting. The way he said distracting made my skin prickle. Was this really happening? Was he flirting with me? No, that couldn't be it, right? But the way his eyes moved slowly over me, the way his voice dipped into something almost intimate, left no room for doubt. I felt like I should say something, maybe tell him to knock it off. Instead, I just stood there, my hands gripping the stack of papers tighter, my mind spinning. I had wanted his attention, and now I had it. But it felt different, dangerous. Relax, he said after a moment, his tone softening just slightly. I'm just making an observation. An observation. Sure. My pulse was racing too fast for me to relax. I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as shaky as I felt, and quickly turned toward the door. I needed to get out of there before I said or did something stupid. But just as I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. Chloe, he called out, and I froze again, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Yeah? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. You know, he said slowly, some things in life are easier when you have someone looking out for you. Someone who notices things. I turned back to face him, my heart thudding in my chest. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was he offering me something? A promotion? A favor? No, this felt like something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to deal with. Thanks for the advice, I said quickly, forcing another smile. I'll keep that in mind. I didn't wait for him to respond. I yanked the door open and stepped out into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My legs felt shaky as I made my way back to my desk, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed between us. Something I didn't fully understand, but something I knew wasn't innocent. For the rest of the day, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, the way his voice had sounded when he said distracting. And the worst part? A tiny, traitorous part of me liked it. The attention. Betention. It made me feel alive. Like I was playing a dangerous game, one where the stakes were too high, but the thrill was impossible to resist. By the time I got home that evening, my mind was a mess. I barely noticed my mom's usual chatter as she asked about my day. I gave her vague answers, hoping she wouldn't pick up on how distracted I was. How could I even begin to explain what had happened? How could I tell her that her husband, my stepfather, had said something that made my pulse race in a way it shouldn't have? That night, lying in bed, I replayed the scene in my mind over and over again. His voice, his eyes, the way he had leaned back so casually, as if he knew exactly what effect he was having on me. And the worst part was, I couldn't stop wondering what would happen next. Because something told me this wasn't the end of it. This was just the beginning. And trust me, things were about to get way more complicated. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. His words, the way he had looked at me, like he could see through every layer I tried to hide behind, kept replaying in my mind. I wore that skirt to make him notice me. I knew exactly what I was doing. But now that it worked, I felt trapped. This wasn't just a little game anymore, it was real. Too real. The next morning, I tried to act normal, like nothing had happened. I kept my head down, focused on my work, and avoided his office as much as possible. Maybe he'd forget it. Maybe I'd forget it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. By lunchtime, I thought I was in the clear. Until I heard his voice behind me. "Chloe, come to my office. We need to talk." His tone was calm, too calm. But there was something underneath it, something that made my stomach twist into knots. I glanced around the office, hoping someone else had heard him, but no one seemed to be paying attention. I forced myself to walk toward his office, my legs feeling heavier with every step. When I stepped inside, he closed the door behind me, and the click of the lock made my heart race. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tension that made the air feel thick. I sat down, trying to keep my expression neutral, though I could feel my hands trembling slightly in my lap. He sat across from me, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You're doing a good job here. But I think you need an extra incentive to keep improving." Incentive. That word made my pulse quicken, but not in a good way. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "What kind of incentive?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. His eyes didn't leave mine, and the way he smiled sent a chill down my spine. "A personal one. Something informal." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Was he really suggesting what I thought he was? My mind spun with a mix of fear and something else, something I didn't want to admit. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me did. Part of me understood exactly what he was implying. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his gaze never wavering. "You're a smart girl, Chloe. I think you know what I mean." I should have stood up right then and there. I should have said no, told him he was out of line, and walked out of that office without looking back. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Because the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to say no. I hated myself for even thinking it, but there was a part of me that was curious. About him. About what he was offering. About where this could lead. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But it was also thrilling. "What if I say no?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then nothing changes," he said with a shrug, as if the whole conversation was no big deal. "But if you say yes, well, let's just say things could get a lot more interesting for both of us." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to make a decision. My hands clenched into fists in my lap, and I felt like the room was closing in around me. This was insane. I shouldn't even be considering it. But the way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped just slightly when he said interesting, it made my head spin. "Think about it," he said, leaning back again, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. "There's no rush. But I think you'll find that this arrangement could work out very well for you." I stood up on shaky legs, unsure how I even managed to move. My mind was screaming at me to get out of there, to put as much distance between us as possible. But before I could reach the door, he added one more thing. "Oh, and Chloe," I turned back, my hand on the doorknob, my heart in my throat. "You look stunning in that skirt." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind me as quickly as I could. As I walked back to my desk, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear. Confusion. Guilt. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something darker. Something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Because the truth was, I liked the way he looked at me. And that scared me more than anything else. And trust me, what happens next? It only gets crazier. You won't believe where this is heading. I could have said no. I could have stood up and walked out, pretending this conversation never happened. But I didn't. You're a beautiful girl, Chloe, James said, his voice lowering to something softer, something dangerously intimate. And I could help you move up the career ladder a lot faster, if you help me unwind after long, stressful days. A voice inside me screamed that this was wrong, so very wrong. But another voice, quieter, more insistent, whispered something else, temptation. For years, I had noticed how strong and self-assured he was, the way he carried himself like he owned the world. And now, he wasn't just looking at me as his stepdaughter. He was looking at me as a woman. And I hated how much that thrilled me. I should have pushed those feelings away. I should have walked out the door. But instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, heart pounding as his words wrapped around me like a net I couldn't escape. What if I say no? I asked, though deep down, I already knew my answer. Then nothing changes, he said with a shrug, that same infuriatingly calm smile on his face. But if you say yes, we both get something we want. The way he said it, so casual, like he wasn't suggesting something completely insane, made my skin tingle. He was offering me a choice, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like a game, one I wasn't sure I could win. Or maybe I didn't want to win. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. This was my chance to walk away, to end this before it went too far. But instead, I nodded. A small, almost imperceptible nod that changed everything. James didn't waste a second. He stood up from his chair, walking around the desk toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. Each step he took made my heart race faster, the air around us thick with tension. When he reached me, he placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch firm but deliberate. Slowly, his hand slid down my arm, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. My skin burned where his fingers had been, and I felt a shiver run through me. You won't regret this, he murmured, his voice so close now, I could feel his breath against my skin. Just trust me. Trust him? That word felt dangerous. Trusting him meant giving in, letting him take control of something I barely understood myself. But at that moment, all I could think about was how close he was, how his hand lingered on mine just a little too long, how his eyes held a promise I wasn't ready to confront. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. This is risky. Everything worth having is, he said, his tone smooth, confident. But I think you already knew that. He was right. I did know. I had known the moment I walked into his office that something had shifted between us, that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. And now, standing this close to him, I couldn't deny the thrill coursing through me. It was reckless, it was dangerous, but it was also exciting. I should go, I whispered, though I didn't move. Said you? His hand slid down to my wrist, his thumb brushing over my skin, sending another shiver through me. Or do you want to stay? That was the question, wasn't it? Did I want to stay? Every logical part of me screamed no. This was wrong. He was my stepfather. This could ruin everything. But another part of me, the part that had chosen that skirt, the part that had stayed when I should have left, wanted more. I took a shaky breath, my eyes meeting his. If I stay, what happens next? A slow smile spread across his face, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in just a little closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Whatever you want, Chloe. The weight of his words hung in the air, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I knew I was on the edge of something I couldn't take back. One step, and everything would change. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I made that step. I stayed. After that day, everything changed. We weren't pretending anymore. The line we've crossed wasn't just blurred, it was gone. And with it, any illusion of control disappeared too. I started staying late at the office, inventing pointless excuses to be alone with him. It didn't matter if there was real work to do. All that mattered was the thrill of those stolen moments, the way his eyes would light up when everyone else had left, the way his touch would linger just a little too long. His touch became something I craved. What scared me the most wasn't how easily he crossed the line, it was how eagerly I welcomed it. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just harmless fun. A little danger to spice up the dull monotony of office life. But it wasn't harmless. And it wasn't just fun. There was a thrill every time his hand brushed against mine, every time he whispered something just for me, words that made my heart race and my breath hitch. It was like being caught in a whirlwind, intoxicating, dizzying, and utterly unstoppable. But with that thrill came something darker, fear. What if someone found out? What if my mom figured out what was happening? The thought of it made my stomach twist into knots. I knew I was playing with fire. I knew I should stop. But every time I thought about walking away, I found myself coming back, wanting more. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, he found me at my desk. "I thought you left already," I said, my voice a little too breathless, a little too eager. "I could say the same about you." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes scanning me in that way that made my pulse quicken. "What are you still doing here?" "Just finishing up some work," I lied. There was nothing urgent in front of me, just a blank screen and a scattered pile of papers I hadn't bothered to sort. He stepped closer, and I felt the tension rise with every step he took. "You know," he said softly, his voice low and intimate, "I've been thinking about you all day." My heart skipped a beat. There it was, that line again, the one we'd already crossed too many times to count. And yet, every time he said something like that, it felt like stepping into dangerous, uncharted territory all over again. This time, I didn't pull away. I didn't try to act indifferent or pretend I didn't know what he meant. Instead, I met his gaze, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline. "Then why don't you just do something about it?" I whispered, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, like he was weighing his options. And then, without another word, he closed the distance between us. That night, something shifted between us. It wasn't just about stolen touches or whispered words anymore. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. And I knew, without a doubt, that there was no going back now. The following days blurred together in a haze of secret meetings and stolen moments. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt charged with electricity. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I started to lose track of time, of reality, of everything except him. But with every passing day, the fear grew stronger. It wasn't just about getting caught, it was about what this meant. What it was turning me into. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk when my phone buzzed with a message from him. "James, come to my office. Now." I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before standing up and making my way to his office. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of excitement and dread. I knew what was waiting for me behind that door, and part of me couldn't wait. When I stepped inside, he was sitting at his desk, but his usual calm demeanor was gone. There was something different about him, something more intense. "Close the door," he said, his voice low. I did as he asked, my pulse racing. Before I could say anything, he stood up and crossed the room, stopping just inches away from me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes locked on mine. "Every time I see you, every time you walk by, it drives me crazy." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should say something, anything, to break the tension. But all I could do was stand there, caught between fear and desire. "You're making this dangerous," I whispered. "Good," he said, stepping even closer. "I like dangerous." That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I like dangerous. Those words echoed in my mind, making it impossible to sleep. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was real. And it was spiraling out of control. I tried to tell myself that I could handle it, that I could keep things under control. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. James had a way of making me forget everything: logic, reason, even fear. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next day, I walked into the office with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I told myself to keep my distance, to avoid him as much as possible. But it didn't take long for that plan to fall apart. By lunchtime, I found myself alone with him again, this time in the break room. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with that same intense gaze that made my knees weak. I thought we agreed to keep things professional, I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out shaky. Did we? He asked, taking a step closer. Because I don't remember agreeing to anything. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. Tell me to stop, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. If you want me to stop, just say the word. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, closing the vital gap between us. And that was it. There was no turning back now. Every moment we shared felt like walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of something that could destroy us both. But no matter how dangerous it got, I couldn't stop. And trust me, what happens next? You won't believe how far this goes. It happened right there in his office. No words. No hesitation. Just raw tension that had been building for weeks, finally exploding. His hands gripped my waist as he pulled me close, and for a moment, the entire world faded away. There was no office, no rules, no one else, just him and me. I felt the heat of his body against mine, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine. And in that instant, all my doubts vanished. I didn't care about the risks, didn't care about the consequences. All that mattered was how alive I felt in that moment. When it was over, I sat on the edge of his desk, trying to gather my thoughts. My heart was still racing, and a strange mix of emotions swirled inside me: excitement, fear, guilt, and something darker. Something forbidden. I didn't know what to do next. Should I leave? Should I say something? But no words came. James leaned back in his chair, watching me with a satisfied smirk, as if he knew exactly how messed up my head was right now. You okay? He asked, his tone casual, almost teasing. I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. Everything felt surreal, like I had crossed into some alternate reality where none of the rules I used to live by mattered anymore. All I knew for certain was one thing: there was no going back. The next morning, I walked into the office, trying to act normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I saw James, I remembered the way his hands had felt on me, the way his voice had sounded in my ear. And worst of all, I wanted it to happen again. But something else was bothering me. Something I couldn't shake off. The way my mom had looked at me that morning before I left the house. There was something in her eyes, something that made my stomach twist in knots. Did she know? Had she figured it out somehow? I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, that there was no way she could know. But that uneasy feeling stayed with me all day, gnawing at the back of my mind like a warning I couldn't ignore. And then, when I got home that evening, it all came crashing down. As soon as I walked through the door, I saw her standing there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. James wasn't home yet, and the house was eerily quiet. Sit down, she said, her voice calm but firm. We need to talk. My heart sank. I knew this was it. The moment I'd been dreading since this whole thing started. I sat down, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to give anything away. What's going on? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes searching mine like she was trying to read my mind. And for a terrifying second, I thought she already knew everything. "You've been acting different lately," she said slowly. "And so has James." I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play dumb with me, Chloe," she snapped, her tone sharper now. "I'm not blind. I see the way you two look at each other." My throat went dry. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said again, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded weak, unconvincing. "Really?" She raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "So you're telling me there's nothing going on between you and my husband?" Her words hit me like a slap. Hearing her say it out loud made it feel even more real, more wrong. I opened my mouth to deny it again, but no words came. Instead, we just sat there in silence, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Later that night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in my room, trying to process everything. She didn't have proof, at least, not yet. But she was suspicious, and that was dangerous. If she kept digging, it was only a matter of time before she found out the truth. I knew I should end it. I knew I should walk away before things got even more out of control. But the thought of never being alone with James again made my chest tighten in a way that scared me. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I couldn't. The next few days were tense. At work, James acted like nothing had happened. He smiled, he flirted, he found excuses to brush against me when no one was looking. But at home, it was different. My mom's eyes followed me everywhere, like she was waiting for me to slip up, waiting for proof that her worst fears were true. The pressure was building, and I could feel it. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, knowing that one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. But I couldn't stop myself. Every time James pulled me aside at work, every time his hand found mine, I felt that same rush, that same thrill. I was addicted. And I knew it. Then came the night that changed everything. James had stayed late at the office again, and I was home alone with my mom. We barely spoke during dinner, the tension between us palpable. Afterward, I went upstairs, trying to avoid another confrontation. But just as I was about to close my bedroom door, I heard her voice. "Chloe." I turned around, my heart pounding. "We're not done," she said, her tone cold. "You might think you can hide whatever's going on, but trust me, secrets don't stay hidden forever." I didn't respond. I just closed the door, my hands trembling. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded.